From the 2017 Ohioana Book Festival, this is Craft. I'm Doug Dangler. I am here today with author Linda Kass, who is the owner of Gramercy Books and the author of Tasa's Song. So welcome to Craft.
Thank you for having me, Doug.
Your book is a very personal project for you, as I understand it, because it follows your grandmother?
My mother, actually.
Your mother,
yes.
Sorry.
And yeah, it's a sort of a novel inspired by truth, I call it, because it is a book of fiction. Tasa was not my mother. However, my mother's life in Eastern Poland as a child during World War II, the touch points of her life really are the touch points of Tasa's life, but Tasa becomes her own character as she moves through these dramatic struggles.
Okay. So when you were thinking about writing this, what was some of the research that you did for it? How did you get into that time period and those ideas?
Good question. Well, first of all, because my background is in journalism, and years ago, having been told many stories as a young child by both my parents, my mother particularly, about her early life, I felt it important to interview my mother and interview my father as well, but interview my mother in particular to this book. And I interviewed her on tape, and this sort of dates me, but I would type it up on my IBM Selectric. That's how long ago it was. And I put those notes in a drawer. And then our daughter went on a college abroad trip to Berlin, and we went to see her, and we went to Poland and Vienna, and obviously in Germany as well. Mm-hmm. And that trip, when I got back, I just could not get the story out of my mind of all those stories that my mother had told me and that I had known because I had interviewed her. Mm-hmm. So that really was the beginning of then further research. And there was still one relative that I could interview who had gone into hiding with her, because there was a point in the book where the character is in hiding with her family members, and this was a younger cousin he's the only one that was still alive. And I also then did a lot of other research, books. There's certainly sometimes just finding a photograph, and I would, what people wore. When you're doing historical fiction, the characters may be imagined, what they say and do may be imagined, but they're operating with real things, whether it's Tasa, who's a violinist, who's playing her violin, what music would she play? What would she wear? What did they listen to on the radio? What were the coins, zlotys, in Poland? So, the research was necessary to get the authentic details of all those concrete objects back then that this character would be interacting with.
You said your background is in journalism. What was it like, sort of qualitatively differently, to interview your mom as opposed to just somebody you're interviewing for a story? Did you feel certain boundaries couldn't be crossed? Did you have hard questions that you couldn't get answered?
That's a great question, and that is something that happened. I think, thinking back to those interviews, I remember I would go to a certain point, and I just seemed to stop. And that's probably why this book is not a nonfiction book, because I didn't really have enough information to understand really what was in her mind, and to be able to really recreate it. I wasn't there, she was there. So the idea of her survival and of really how she represented so many who survived. Let me just kind of explain. This character and my mother lived in the eastern swath of Poland, and that part of Poland was 17 days after World War II began, when Germany attacked Poland. It was traded over and given to Stalin and the Soviets to control for 2 years. So the first 2 years, these people, like my mother, like Tasa, who lived in the eastern swath of Poland, were under Soviet oppression. And then in 1941, they were under the Germans. So this was kind of a different story. It was really people on the fringes of the battlefield. She grew up in a little rural, really farm almost, very small little village. And so I created that same kind of feel in terms of where this character grew up and where she lived. And it's so important to remember this, these stories, because it's one thing to read a history book, it's another thing to, and people suffered, people lost their lives, but then to really, in historical fiction, get into the mind of a character and understand how that person suffered.
How difficult was it for you when you were writing it to say, I know this is what my mother went through, but I want the character to do something different that maybe is worse for the character or not as bad as it was for your mother? One of those two, where you think, this is a break point for me, where it really becomes more fiction for me. You know what I mean? Because there's that, you've got the backbone of one story, and that story, but you've also got, I need to fictionalize it. But I feel like there's some tension there between what you can fictionalize and you don't want to make it too fictionalized, right?
Well, World War II is a very knowable fact. And historical fiction, you're really, you're depending on what historical area you're looking at. You're taking, you're putting that context, which is true, and you can't play around with World War II. I mean, that stayed the same. But this character did, sort of interact with, things that happened as the book progressed and became her own person. I wouldn't have thought, for example, that when she was a teenager under Soviet oppression, that she would do a big prank, a teenage prank. I'm thinking I'm probably putting myself into the thought of, my own daughter as a teenager, or what teenagers do, and they fight back, and so that just happened to this character. I mean, my mother never told me anything about anything like that, and it's really an interesting kind of fun scene. It was fun to write, of her and a bunch of her friends and what happened one New Year's Eve, So those things happen, and you let the character do that.
Okay. Well, Linda Kass, I thank you so much for talking to me today on craft. And again, the book is called Tasa's Song. Have a great day today at Ohioana.
Thank you so much for having me, Doug.
For more information from my guests, visit www.crafttheshow.com. This is Doug Dangler. Until next time, be creative.